Sarah Martinez kicked a small stone as she walked down the empty sidewalk. The late afternoon sun felt too bright for such a terrible day. Her nursing bag felt heavier than usual, probably because she knew she wouldn't be carrying it to work tomorrow. Or ever again to that hospital. The meeting with her supervisor had lasted exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes to end a career she had built over 8 years. Budget cuts, they said. Last hired, first fired, they explained. But Sarah knew the real reason. She had spoken up too many times about patient safety. She had questioned the new policies that put profits before people. She had made enemies in the wrong places. Walking home seemed like the right thing to do. The bus fare could buy groceries instead. Every dollar mattered now. Her small apartment was only 3 miles away, and the walk would give her time to think about what came next. The unemployment office would be her first stop tomorrow morning. Then, she would start calling other hospitals, even though she knew the word would already be out about her. The neighborhood grew quieter as she left the busy streets near the hospital. Tall oak trees lined the sidewalk, their leaves creating dancing shadows on the pavement. A few children played in a front yard, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of lawnmowers. Normal life continuing while hers had just fallen apart. Sarah pulled out her phone to call her sister Maria, but the battery was dead. Just like everything else today. She tucked it back into her pocket and kept walking. Maria would find out soon enough. The whole family would know by dinner time that Sarah had lost her job. Again. This was the third hospital in 5 years. Maybe nursing wasn't meant for her after all. A dog barked somewhere behind a wooden fence. A postal worker waved from across the street. An elderly woman watered flowers in her garden. Everything looked so peaceful and ordinary. Sarah wondered if any of these people had ever been fired. If they had ever walked home carrying the weight of failure and uncertainty. The sun was getting lower now, casting long shadows across the quiet residential streets. Sarah's feet were starting to hurt in her white nursing shoes. She had been wearing them for 12 hours during her last shift, never knowing it would actually be her last shift. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was walking away from saving lives just as someone, somewhere, might need those skills. Her mind wandered to Mrs. Patterson, the elderly patient in room 302. Sarah had spent extra time with her yesterday, helping her eat dinner and listening to stories about her late husband. Who would do that now? Who would make sure Mrs. Patterson felt less alone? The new nurse would be too busy following protocols and meeting quotas to sit and hold an old woman's hand. The neighborhood was changing as she walked. The houses were getting smaller, the yards less manicured. This was where real people lived. People who worked multiple jobs to pay rent. People who understood what it meant to be one paycheck away from disaster. Sarah belonged here more than she had ever belonged in the sterile halls of the hospital where administrators wore expensive suits and talked about efficiency while nurses worked themselves to exhaustion. A police car drove slowly past, the officer giving her a friendly nod. Sarah nodded back and kept walking. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Just a woman walking home after the worst day of her professional life. Nothing suspicious about that. Although she probably looked exactly like what she was, someone whose world had just crumbled. The evening air was getting cooler, and Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She had knitted it herself during long winter nights when she was studying for her nursing boards. Back when she thought she was building something permanent and meaningful. Back when she believed that caring about patients mattered more than hospital politics. 2 blocks ahead, she could see the small grocery store where she usually stopped to buy milk and bread. Tonight she would walk past it. There wasn't money for extras anymore. She would need to take inventory of what was in her refrigerator and make it last until she figured out her next move. Ramen noodles might become her new best friend. The sound of children playing was fading as the day grew later. Front porch lights were starting to come on in windows. Families were gathering for dinner, sharing stories about their day. Sarah envied them their normal problems and everyday routines. She envied them their jobs and their stability and their certainty about tomorrow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she remembered it was dead. Probably just a text message anyway. Maybe from Maria asking how work went today. Sarah would have to find the words to explain what happened. She would have to admit that she had failed again, that her principals had cost her another job, that maybe she was the problem after all. The familiar street sign came into view. Maple Avenue. Only 6 more blocks to her apartment. 6 more blocks to close the door on this day and pretend it had been a bad dream. 6 more blocks to start figuring out how to rebuild her life once more. Sarah straightened her shoulders and kept walking toward whatever came next. The first helicopter appeared as a distant speck against the darkening sky. Sarah barely noticed it at first. Living near the city meant helicopters were common, news crews covering traffic, medical flights heading to the trauma center, police patrols monitoring the highways. She kept walking, lost in thoughts about updating her resume and practicing interview answers. But the sound grew louder instead of fading away. Much louder. The steady thump-thump-thump of rotor blades was getting closer, and it was joined by another identical sound. Sarah looked up to see 2 military helicopters flying low over the residential neighborhood. Too low. Much too low for normal flight patterns. The aircraft were dark green with official markings she couldn't quite read from the ground. They moved with purpose, not the lazy circles of traffic helicopters or the straight lines of transport flights. These pilots were looking for something. Or someone. The powerful downdraft from their rotors was bending tree branches and scattering leaves across the street. Other people had noticed too. An older man came out of his house to look up at the sky. A woman called her children inside. Dogs were barking throughout the neighborhood. Whatever was happening, it wasn't routine. Sarah stopped walking and watched the helicopters circle the area about 2 blocks ahead of her current position. The lead helicopter suddenly descended even lower, hovering just above the tree line. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker, amplified and urgent but distorted by the wind and engine noise. Sarah couldn't make out the words at first. She moved closer, her nursing instincts telling her that urgent voices from helicopters usually meant someone was in trouble. "Where's the nurse?" The words crackled through the air with unmistakable clarity. Sarah felt her heart skip. She looked around to see if there were other nurses in the area, but the street was mostly empty now except for a few curious neighbors peering from their doorways. The helicopter was circling directly overhead, the loudspeaker repeating the same urgent call. "Where's the nurse? We need the nurse." Without thinking, Sarah raised her arms and waved. She shouted back, though she knew they probably couldn't hear her over the noise. "I'm here. I'm a nurse." Her voice felt small against the thunderous sound of the aircraft. The helicopter pilot must have seen her because the aircraft immediately descended further, looking for a place to land. The second helicopter continued circling overhead, maintaining a watch position. Sarah's mind was racing. Who were they looking for? How did they know a nurse was in this neighborhood? What kind of emergency required military helicopters to hunt for medical personnel? The lead helicopter settled into a small park at the end of the street, its rotors still spinning but at a slower speed. 2 soldiers in combat gear jumped out and ran toward Sarah. Their faces were tense with urgency, and one of them was speaking rapidly into a radio headset. "Ma'am, are you the nurse?" The first soldier had to shout to be heard. He was young, maybe 25, with serious eyes and dirt on his uniform that suggested he had been in the field for hours. "Yes, I'm a registered nurse," Sarah called back. "What's the emergency?" "We have a critical situation about 15 minutes flight time from here. Multiple casualties. Our medic is down, and we need immediate medical assistance. Will you come with us?" Sarah's training kicked in before her mind could process the strangeness of the situation. Multiple casualties meant people were dying. It meant someone needed her skills right now. The fact that she had been fired 3 hours ago suddenly seemed irrelevant. "What kind of casualties?" "Do you have supplies?" she asked, already moving toward the helicopter. "Industrial accident at a chemical facility." Several workers trapped with severe burns and respiratory distress. We have basic field medical supplies, but we need someone with advanced training. The second soldier was already on his radio, reporting that they had located medical personnel. Sarah could hear fragments of his conversation over the helicopter noise. Package secured. ETA 15 minutes, nurse on board. As they reached the helicopter, Sarah realized she was still carrying her nursing bag. The same bag that had felt so heavy with failure just minutes ago now felt light with purpose. Inside were basic supplies she always carried: stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, emergency medications, trauma shears. Not much, but better than nothing. The soldier helped her climb into the helicopter. The interior was Spartan but functional, with bench seats along the sides and medical equipment secured in compartments. A third soldier was already inside, working frantically over someone lying on a stretcher. Sarah could see it was another soldier, unconscious and pale. "This is Martinez, our medic," the first soldier explained as he secured Sarah's safety harness. "IED blast from earlier today. He's been stabilized but he's not conscious. You'll be working alone on the casualties." Sarah nodded and immediately moved to check the injured medic's vital signs. His breathing was shallow but steady, pulse rapid but strong. Someone had done good work stabilizing him, probably these soldiers themselves. They clearly had medical training even if they weren't qualified to handle major trauma cases. The helicopter lifted off as Sarah continued her assessment. Through the open door, she could see her neighborhood shrinking below. The street where she had been walking looked tiny and peaceful from this height. Just minutes ago, her biggest problem had been unemployment. Now she was flying toward a disaster scene with people's lives depending on her skills. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset they had given her. 8 minutes to target. Multiple ambulances are en route, but we'll arrive first. Command says there are at least 6 casualties, possibly more still trapped inside the facility. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This was exactly the kind of situation they had prepared for in nursing school but hoped to never face in real life. Mass casualties, limited supplies, no backup, and people who would die without immediate intervention. Everything she had learned in 8 years of nursing was about to be tested under the worst possible conditions. The soldier across from her was checking equipment and speaking into his radio. ETA 7 minutes. Medical personnel on board and ready. Request ground support and additional medical supplies at the landing zone. Sarah opened her nursing bag and took inventory of what she had available. It wasn't much, but she had worked miracles with less. The most important tool she carried was her knowledge and experience. That couldn't be taken away by budget cuts or hospital politics. Tonight, it might be the only thing standing between life and death for strangers she had never met. The chemical facility looked like a war zone from the air. Thick black smoke poured from one building while emergency lights flashed red and blue across the industrial complex. Sarah could see ambulances arriving, their sirens barely audible over the helicopter noise. Fire trucks were already on scene, their powerful hoses sending streams of water and foam toward the burning structure. "Landing zone is clear," the pilot announced. 60 seconds to touchdown. Sarah gripped her bag tighter and watched the ground rush up to meet them. This was it. Everything she had learned, every life she had helped save, every difficult case she had handled in 8 years of nursing had prepared her for this moment. The irony wasn't lost on her that the hospital had fired her for caring too much about patients, and now she was about to risk everything for people she didn't even know. The helicopter touched down in a parking area about 50 yards from the main building. The soldiers were out and moving before the skids hit the ground. Sarah unbuckled her harness and followed, staying low under the spinning rotors as they had instructed her. The scene was chaos. Workers in hard hats and safety vests were directing emergency vehicles while others sat on the ground being treated by paramedics. The acrid smell of chemicals burned her nose and throat. Sarah could taste the smoke in the air, thick and bitter. This was worse than any hospital emergency she had ever handled. A fire chief in full protective gear ran up to them. "Are you the nurse?" We've got 6 confirmed casualties, 3 critical. 2 more workers still trapped inside, but we can't get to them yet. The building isn't stable. Sarah nodded and followed him toward a makeshift triage area that had been set up using ambulance stretchers and emergency blankets. Her mind automatically shifted into crisis mode, prioritizing patients based on severity and likelihood of survival. It was brutal mathematics, but it saved lives. The first patient was a middle-aged man with severe burns on his arms and face. He was conscious but clearly in shock, his skin pale and clammy despite the heat from the fire. Sarah knelt beside him and began her assessment, checking his airway and breathing while looking for signs of inhalation injury. "What's your name?" she asked, taking his pulse. It was rapid and weak. "David. David Chen. Is my crew okay? There were 5 of us in there." His voice was hoarse from smoke inhalation. "We're taking care of everyone," Sarah told him, which was both true and optimistic. She turned to the paramedic working beside her. "He needs 4 fluids immediately and morphine for pain management. Watch for signs of respiratory distress." The second casualty was unconscious, a young woman who had been closest to the explosion. Her injuries were severe, possible internal bleeding, definite concussion, and burns covering 30% of her body. Sarah worked quickly, establishing an airway and checking for spinal injuries while calling out instructions to the emergency responders. "We need to get her to the trauma center immediately," Sarah announced. "She won't survive much longer without surgery." Time became a blur of medical procedures and urgent decisions. Sarah moved from patient to patient, triaging injuries and coordinating with the paramedics and fire department personnel. Her hands moved automatically, checking pulses, administering medications, stabilizing injuries. Her mind calculated and recalculated priorities as new information became available. The third critical patient was an older man who had been trapped under falling debris. The soldiers who had brought her were now helping to carry stretchers and assist with medical procedures. They followed her instructions without question, their military training making them ideal assistants in a crisis situation. "His leg is broken in at least 2 places," Sarah told them as they prepared to move him to an ambulance. "Keep that splint stable and watch for signs of shock during transport." More emergency personnel kept arriving. Additional ambulances, a hazmat team, even a mobile command unit that looked like something from a disaster movie. But Sarah barely noticed the growing crowd. Her entire world had narrowed to the immediate needs of the injured workers. The fire chief appeared beside her again. "We got the other 2 out. Both alive, both conscious. Burns and smoke inhalation, but they're walking." Sarah felt a wave of relief. No one had died. Not yet anyway. The critical patients were being transported to hospitals with trauma centers. The others would recover with proper treatment. It could have been much worse. As the last ambulance pulled away, Sarah finally had a moment to process what had just happened. She was covered in soot and blood, her uniform torn and dirty. Her hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. But everyone was alive. Everyone would have a chance to go home to their families. The soldier who had first approached her walked over with a bottle of water. "Outstanding work, ma'am. You probably saved 3 lives tonight." Sarah accepted the water gratefully and drank deeply. The smoke had left her mouth dry and her throat raw. "It's what we do," she said simply. "It's what nurses do." Not all nurses would have climbed into a military helicopter to fly to a disaster scene, he pointed out. Especially not after. He paused, looking uncertain. "After what?" Sarah asked. "Well, we knew you had just been terminated from your position at the hospital. Command had been monitoring emergency radio traffic and knew there was a nurse in this area. When we couldn't locate any on-duty medical personnel nearby, they authorized us to conduct the search." Sarah stared at him. "You knew I had been fired?" "Yes, ma'am. But we also knew that didn't change your training or your ability to save lives. We needed a nurse, and you were a nurse. Everything else was irrelevant. For the first time that day, Sarah felt something other than failure and uncertainty. She felt proud. Proud that she had been ready when people needed her. Proud that her instincts had been right to wave at the helicopter. Proud that 8 years of training had prepared her for this moment when it truly mattered. The helicopter pilot was calling for boarding. They were ready to return her to her neighborhood, to her quiet street and her uncertain future. But something had changed during those intense 2 hours. Sarah had remembered who she really was and why she had become a nurse in the first place. As they lifted off from the industrial complex, Sarah looked down at the scene below. The fire was under control now, the smoke clearing, the emergency vehicles beginning to disperse. Tomorrow there would be investigations and reports and insurance claims. But tonight, 6 people were alive who might not have been without immediate medical intervention. The flight back was quiet except for the helicopter noise. Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel tired. It had been the longest day of her life, starting with unemployment and ending with the most challenging medical emergency she had ever faced. But, for the first time in months, she felt like herself again. She felt like a nurse. The helicopter set down in the same small park where they had picked her up hours earlier. The neighborhood looked different now in the darkness, streetlights creating pools of warm yellow light, porch lamps glowing in windows, the peaceful quiet of families settling in for the night. Sarah could hardly believe this was the same place where her world had fallen apart just that afternoon. The soldiers helped her down from the aircraft, and the first one handed her a business card. "Ma'am, this has contact information for our unit commander. He'll want to speak with you about what happened tonight. There may be commendations involved." Sarah looked at the card in the dim light. Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, Emergency Response Coordinator. It felt surreal to be holding military contact information after the day she had experienced. Also, the soldier continued, "I took the liberty of contacting the media. They're going to want to interview you about tonight." A nurse who responded to an emergency on the same day she lost her job, that's a story people need to hear. Before Sarah could respond, the helicopter was lifting off again, leaving her standing alone in the park with her nursing bag and a business card. The sudden quiet felt strange after hours of helicopter noise, radio chatter, and emergency chaos. She could hear crickets chirping and the distant sound of television sets through open windows. The walk home was only 3 blocks, but Sarah moved slowly, processing everything that had happened. Her white nursing shoes were now gray with soot and dirt. Her uniform would never be the same. But she felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. Her apartment building came into view, the familiar red brick and green awning looking like a sanctuary after the chaos of the evening. Sarah climbed the 2 flights to her door and fumbled for her keys. Her hands were steadier now, but she could feel the exhaustion settling into her bones. Inside her small apartment, Sarah set down her nursing bag and looked at herself in the hallway mirror. She barely recognized the person staring back at her. Her hair was disheveled, her face smudged with soot, her clothes torn and stained. But her eyes looked different. They looked like the eyes of someone who had remembered why they mattered. The answering machine was blinking with 7 messages. Sarah pressed play as she began to remove her ruined uniform. The first message was from her sister Maria. "Sarah, I heard about what happened at the hospital. Call me when you get home. We'll figure this out together." The second was from her former supervisor. "Sarah, it's Linda. I heard about tonight. Channel 6 News called asking for a comment. I wanted to talk to you about coming back. We may have been hasty in our decision." Sarah paused in pulling off her cardigan. Her former supervisor wanted to talk about her coming back? The same woman who had terminated her employment just hours ago? The third message was from a reporter. "Ms. Martinez, this is Janet Chen with Channel 6 News. We'd like to interview you about your heroic response to tonight's chemical plant emergency. Please call me as soon as possible." There were 4 more messages, 2 from other news stations, 1 from a different hospital offering an interview, and 1 from her landlord who had somehow heard about the evening's events and wanted to make sure she was okay. Sarah sat down on her couch and stared at the phone. This morning she had been a terminated employee walking home in defeat. Tonight she was apparently a local hero with job offers and interview requests. The world had turned completely upside down in the span of 12 hours. Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. The caller ID showed Maria's number. Sarah. Oh my God, are you okay? It's all over the news. They're saying you saved multiple lives after being fired from your job today. Is that really what happened? Sarah found herself laughing, which surprised her. Yeah, that's what happened. I was walking home feeling sorry for myself when 2 military helicopters started circling the neighborhood looking for a nurse. It was completely insane, Maria. The news is calling you a hero. They have footage of you working on the casualties. Sarah, you looked like you belonged there. Like you were born to handle emergencies. After hanging up with Maria, Sarah made herself a cup of tea and sat down to think. The business card from the military unit was still in her pocket, along with several others that reporters had somehow gotten to her through neighbors who had witnessed the helicopter landing. She thought about the patients she had treated tonight. David Chen with his burns and smoke inhalation, asking about his crew even while in shock. The young woman who had been unconscious and fighting for her life. The older man with the broken leg who had thanked her even while they were loading him into the ambulance. Those people hadn't cared that she had been fired. They hadn't cared about her employment status or her conflicts with hospital administration. They had needed a nurse, and she had been there. It was that simple and that complicated. Sarah's laptop was still open on her kitchen table from that morning when she had been updating her resume. The document seemed pathetic now, a list of jobs and qualifications that missed the most important thing about being a nurse. Tonight had reminded her that nursing wasn't about hospitals or supervisors or budget meetings. It was about being ready when people needed you most. The next morning brought more phone calls and interview requests. Sarah agreed to speak with the local news station, partly because she wanted people to understand what had really happened. The reporter, Janet Chen, turned out to be the sister of David Chen, one of the workers Sarah had treated. My brother is going to be fine thanks to you, Janet said as they set up for the interview. He told me that you stayed calm when everyone else was panicking. That you knew exactly what to do. The interview was broadcast that evening, along with helicopter footage that someone had taken of the rescue scene. Watching herself work on the casualties was surreal for Sarah. She looked confident and competent, moving from patient to patient with purpose and skill. She looked like the nurse she had always wanted to be. 3 days later, Sarah was sitting in the office of Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of emergency medicine at Metropolitan General Hospital. Dr. Williams had called personally to offer Sarah a position in their trauma unit. We need nurses who can think under pressure, Dr. Williams explained. What you did at that chemical plant, that's the kind of nursing we need in our emergency department. Real nursing, not just following protocols. Sarah accepted the position that afternoon. It was a better job than the one she had lost, with better pay and the kind of autonomy she had always wanted. But, more importantly, it was a chance to practice nursing the way she believed it should be practiced. 6 months later, Sarah was training new nurses in emergency response techniques. She told them about the night she was fired from her previous job and ended up saving lives from a military helicopter. She told them that being a nurse meant being ready for anything, at any time, under any circumstances. The most important thing you carry isn't your stethoscope or your medications, she would tell the new nurses. It's your willingness to help when help is needed, regardless of what else is happening in your life. Sarah kept the business card from Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez on her desk as a reminder of that night. Sometimes the worst days led to the most important moments. Sometimes losing everything was the only way to remember what really mattered. And, sometimes, when you're walking home after the worst day of your career, the universe sends helicopters to remind you exactly who you're supposed to be.